The silence in Elian's apartment was a manufactured thing, a sterile hum that vibrated just beneath the threshold of hearing. It was the sound of recycled air, of triple-paned glass insulating him from the city's chaotic symphony, of a life curated to the point of suffocation. He sat on the edge of his bed, a single grey sheet pulled taut over the mattress, and watched the light from the chem lumens overhead bleach the color from his skin. The walls were white, the floor was polished concrete, the furniture was a minimalist arrangement of chrome and resin, each piece chosen by his brother, Reese, for its lack of texture, its lack of scent, its lack of life. It was a room designed to nullify, to erase, to protect. For years it had worked. The daily regimen of suppressants, the carefully controlled diet, the environmental isolation. They had conspired to keep his biology a secret, even from himself. He was an Omega, a designation that felt like a line of code from a forgotten program, irrelevant to the placid surface of his existence. He was simply Elian, Reese's younger brother, a fragile thing to be shielded from a world that would tear him apart. But the silence was breaking. It began as a subtle tremor in his blood, a low thrumming that had nothing to do with the building's systems. A warmth coiled deep in his belly, unfamiliar and insistent. The suppressants, usually a cool wave of chemical peace that washed through him every morning, had felt different today. Thinner, less potent. He had dismissed it as anxiety, a phantom of the mind. Now he could not ignore the evidence of his own body. A faint, sweet scent, like bruised gardenias and rain-soaked earth, was rising from his skin. It was his scent, a thing he had only read about in medical texts, and its presence in the sterile air of his apartment was a violation, a catastrophic system failure. He pressed his palms against the cool sheet, his breath catching in his throat. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the burgeoning heat. Reese would be home in 3 hours. Reese, with his calm, measured voice and his eyes that saw everything as a problem to be solved, a variable to be controlled. Reese, who had built this cage of love and fear around him since their parents were gone. He would see the flush on Elian's cheeks. He would smell the unforgivable scent of his nature. He would fix it. The thought of being fixed was more terrifying than the strange fire blooming in his veins. The chime at his door was a discordant note in the symphony of his panic. It was too early for Reese. He never deviated from his schedule. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came here except his brother. He rose, his limbs feeling strangely heavy, and moved towards the door's integrated comms panel. The face that appeared on the screen stole the air from his lungs. Kalen, his brother's best friend. An alpha. An alpha of such potent stillness and formidable presence that even through the filtered lens of the camera, Elian felt the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Kalen stood there, his dark coat dusted with the city's perpetual drizzle, his expression unreadable. His scent, a force of nature Elian had only ever experienced in carefully controlled, brief encounters, was a phantom on the edge of his senses, a promise of pine and cold stone and something ancient, like a winter forest. Elian, Kalen's voice was a low baritone, smooth and calm, yet it vibrated through the speaker and straight into Elian's bones. Reese sent me. He's been held up at the Enclave. He asked me to check on you. It was a lie. Or, if not a lie, a carefully constructed half-truth. Reese would never send an alpha to his door, least of all Kalen. Reese managed Kalen's presence around Elion with the precision of a scientist handling volatile materials. Limited exposure, no direct contact, never, ever, alone. Something was wrong. The warmth in his stomach tightened into a knot of dread, and something else, something shameful and thrilling. He had to send him away. He had to protect the secret that was, at this very moment, blooming from his pores. He reached for the control panel, his fingers trembling. "I'm fine," he managed, his voice thin and reedy. "Thank you, Kalen. You don't need to." But it was too late. The scent from his own body, that traitorous perfume of gardenia and rain, was intensifying, and through the door's filtration system he caught the barest hint of Kalen's response. The air outside the door thickened, a change in pressure, a sharpening of focus. Kalen's eyes, dark and piercing on the screen, narrowed. He knew. An alpha always knew. The automated lock on the door clicked open. Not from his side. Kalen had Reese's access codes. Of course he did. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and the world rushed in. Kalen's scent was no longer a phantom. It was a physical presence, a wave of cold, clean forest air that crashed against the sterile nothingness of the apartment. It filled the space, saturated it, and wrapped around Elion's burgeoning heat, not to smother it, but to call to it. The warmth in his veins ignited. The tremor became a full-body shudder. His own scent, a desperate, sweet plume, flooded the room in response. Kalen stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the corridor. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched Elion, his gaze sweeping over him, taking in the feverish flush on his skin, the dilated pupils, the tremor in his hands. There was no judgment in his eyes, no predatory gleam. There was only a profound, unnerving stillness, a quiet recognition. The silence was broken. The system had failed, and in its place stood an alpha, his best friend's little brother's keeper, his scent a key turning in a lock Elion never knew existed. The cage was open, and Elion was terrified of what was about to step inside. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was an Omega in the throes of his first terrifying heat, and the one man his brother had tried to keep him from was standing in his doorway, breathing in his ruin. The moments after the door slid open stretched into a strange, distorted eternity. Elion felt pinned by Kalen's gaze, a specimen under glass, every shuddering breath, every frantic pulse point exposed. The mingling of their scents was a dizzying, intoxicating chaos. His own, sweet and pleading, a scent of burgeoning life and desperate vulnerability. Kalen's, a deep grounding anchor of ancient forests and storm-washed granite, a scent that promised stability and overwhelming power in equal measure. It didn't attack. It simply occupied. It filled the empty spaces in the air, in Elion's lungs, in the hollow chambers of his heart, which now beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a primal urge to fold in on himself, to hide the scent pouring from his skin. But another, deeper instinct urged him to lean into the solid presence in the doorway, to breathe it in until the sterile white walls of his world dissolved completely. Kalen finally moved, stepping inside and allowing the door to hiss shut behind him. The sound was one of finality. He shrugged off his damp coat, the movement economical and precise, and laid it over the back of a chrome chair. The action was so normal, so mundane. It was jarring against the high-frequency tension thrumming between them. "Reese didn't send me," Kalen said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been through the comms. He wasn't looking at Elian now. His attention focused on the small, sterile kitchen unit in the corner of the main room. He opened a cupboard, his movements fluid and unhurried. I was at the Enclave for a meeting. I saw his biometrics feed. His cortisol levels were spiking. He was trying to get clearance to leave, citing a domestic emergency. They denied him. He pulled out a glass, his knuckles white as he gripped it. When Reese is panicked, he becomes predictable. He either comes here or he calls me. He hadn't called me. He turned, the glass in his hand, and his dark eyes finally met Elian's again. So, I came here. The explanation was clinical, logical. It was the kind of reasoning Reese would use. But the look in Kaelin's eyes was anything but. There was a depth there, a turbulent darkness that Elian had only ever glimpsed before. He saw concern, yes, but also a tightly coiled restraint, a tension in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders that betrayed a battle being waged within him. He was an alpha confronted with the raw scent of an unmated, unsuppressed Omega. The air crackled with the force of his control. "What's happening to me?" Elian whispered, the words feeling fragile and foolish. He knew what was happening. He'd read the literature Reese had curated for him. Redacted, clinical. Texts that described the Omega condition as a biological flaw, a volatile hormonal cascade that required lifelong management. A sickness. Kaelin walked to the water dispenser and filled the glass. The sound of the water was unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Your suppressants have failed," he stated, not unkindly. "It's a preheat, the early stages." He held the glass out to Elian. His hand was steady, a stark contrast to Elian's, which trembled as he reached out to take it. Their fingers brushed. A spark of heat, sharp and electric, shot up Elian's arm. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if burned. The glass slipped, but Kaelin's reflexes were faster. He caught it easily. Not a drop spilled. The brief contact left a phantom warmth on Elian's skin, and Kaelin's scent now clung to him, a ghost of pine and stone. The alpha's jaw tightened another fraction. He set the glass down on a nearby table. "Reese has kept you on a high-dosage synthetic regimen since you were 16, hasn't he?" It wasn't a question. Kaelin knew. How much did he know? How much had Reese, in his desperate need for a confidant, confessed to his oldest friend? Elian remembered fragments of his childhood, flashes of memory before the white walls and the sterile silence. He remembered a garden, the smell of damp earth after a rainstorm, his mother's laugh. He remembered his father, a gentle beta, lifting him onto his shoulders. And he remembered the incident, a blur of shouting, of his mother's terrified scent, of Reese, just a teenager himself, pulling him into a closet and holding a hand over his mouth, whispering, "Be quiet, Eli. Don't make a sound. Don't let them smell you." He'd been too young to understand. He only knew that after that day, the world had shrunk, the colors had faded, and the suppressants had begun. His life had become a long, quiet exercise in erasure. "He was protecting me," Elian said, the words a reflexive defense of the only life he knew. "From this," Kaelin's expression was unreadable. "He was keeping you in a cage," he corrected, his voice low and intense. "He loves you, Elian. I have never doubted that. But his fear has built your prison." The heat in Elian's body was intensifying, moving in waves now, a slow, insistent tide. His legs felt weak. He sank onto the edge of the sofa, the cool synthetic leather a shock against his feverish skin. He wrapped his arms around himself, a futile attempt to contain the scent, the heat, the overwhelming reality of his own body waking from a long, chemically induced slumber. Kalen watched him, his posture rigid. He stood several feet away, a deliberate distance. "We don't have much time," he said, his tone shifting, becoming more urgent. "When Reese is finally cleared, he'll come here. And when he finds you like this, he'll call the Omega Affairs Bureau. They'll sedate you, transport you to a secure facility, and recalibrate your regimen. They'll see you as a failed experiment, a risk. You'll lose what little autonomy you have left." The clinical, detached words painted a picture more terrifying than any primal threat. A sterile room, needles, faceless technicians in white coats. A continuation of his current life, only colder, more permanent. The end of Elian and the beginning of a case file. Panic clawed at his throat again, sharp and suffocating. "What do we do?" The "we" slipped out, an unconscious plea, an admission of his utter helplessness. Kalen's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "You have a choice," he said. "You can stay here and wait for Reese to handle this his way, or you can come with me. Now. Go with you. Where?" The idea was nonsensical. He never went anywhere without Reese. His world was this apartment, the private transport to the medical center, the manicured sky park on the building's roof. Kalen was offering him the unknown, a terrifying void outside his cage. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Reese can't find you. Somewhere you can get through this. He didn't say heat. He didn't have to. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken implications. An alpha, an omega, in heat, alone. It was the scenario Reese had dedicated his life to preventing. "Why?" Elian asked, the question a raw whisper. "Why would you do this? You're his friend." Kalen's eyes held his, and for the first time, the impenetrable control in them cracked, revealing a glimpse of something raw and aching beneath. "Because I've watched him slowly erase you for 10 years, he said, his voice rough with an emotion Elian couldn't name. "And I won't stand by and watch the Bureau finish the job." A wave of heat, stronger than any before, washed over Elian, making his head swim. The scent of gardenias and rain intensified, thick and cloying. He saw Kalen's nostrils flare, saw the muscles in his neck cord with tension. The alpha was fighting his own instincts, a battle so profound Elian could almost feel the vibrations of it in the air. The choice was simple, a sterile, institutionalized death of the self, or a terrifying leap into the unknown with an alpha whose presence was systematically undoing him. He looked at the white walls, the grey sheets, the chrome furniture. It was not a home. It was a tomb, and for the first time in his life, he wanted to live. "Okay," he breathed. "I'll go with you." The decision, once made, unleashed a torrent of new sensations. The air itself seemed to thin, making each breath a conscious effort. Elian's body, now that it had been given a direction, a purpose other than waiting for containment, accelerated its rebellion. The warmth in his core became a liquid fire, spreading through his limbs, making his skin hypersensitive. The texture of his own clothes felt abrasive, the cool air from the vent a physical blow. Kalen's scent was the only constant, a lodestar in the swirling storm of his senses. It was a scent that promised both danger and an impossible safety. Kalen moved with swift, decisive purpose. There was no hesitation. "We leave through the service corridors. Less surveillance," he said, his voice a low command that cut through Elian's disorientation. "Get a coat. Nothing else." A coat. Elian looked at his closet. a row of identical grey jackets, all made of the same scent-neutral synthetic fabric. He pulled one on, his fingers clumsy. The act of preparing to leave, to transgress the invisible boundaries of his existence, felt monumental, unreal. He was a ghost stepping out of his own haunting. As he fumbled with the coat, Kalen was at the apartment's main console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. "I'm looping the internal sensors for the next 12 hours. It will appear as if you're in a sleep cycle. It won't fool Reese for long, but it will buy us time." His efficiency was chilling. It spoke of a familiarity with deception, with navigating the unseen systems that governed their lives. This was not an impulsive act for him. It was a calculated risk. They left the apartment, stepping into the sterile white corridor. Elian had only ever walked this hall to get to the elevator that went to the lobby or the medical wing. Kalen led him in the opposite direction, towards a plain, unmarked panel at the end of the hall. He pressed his palm against it, and a section of the wall slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a dimly lit, narrow passage. The air inside was different. It was cold, metallic, smelling of ozone and dust. It was the building's circulatory system, its hidden anatomy. Stepping inside felt like slipping between the ribs of the beast that had housed him. The panels slid shut behind them, plunging them into near darkness, lit only by thin strips of emergency lighting along the floor. The sudden confinement should have been terrifying, but it was a different kind of enclosed space. It was functional, raw, and honest. It wasn't pretending to be a home. Elian's heat-muddled mind struggled to keep up. He stumbled, his legs unsteady. A strong hand gripped his elbow, steadying him. Kalen. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet the warmth of his skin through the fabric of their coats was an incendiary brand. Elian's breath hitched. The contact, meant to be stabilizing, sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated sensation through him. He could feel the strength in Kalen's grip, the latent power held in check. He could smell the sharp, clean scent of the alpha's skin up close, a complex undertone of pine and something uniquely, personally Kalen. It was overwhelming. He pulled his arm away, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, shocking instinct that if Kalen kept touching him, he would simply melt into a puddle at his feet. Kalen let go immediately, his hand dropping to his side. He didn't speak, but Elian felt the shift in his posture, the renewed tension. The alpha was walking a razor's edge of control. They navigated the labyrinthine corridors in silence, their footsteps echoing softly on the metal grating. It was a descent, spiraling down into the guts of the high-rise. The air grew colder, damper. Finally, they emerged into a sub-level parking garage, a cavernous concrete space filled with sleek, anonymous transport vehicles. The air here was thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and cold concrete, a smell of transience and escape. Kalen led him to a dark, powerful-looking vehicle, its lines more utilitarian than the luxury transports in the main levels. The doors unlocked with a soft click as they approached. "Get in," Kalen said, his voice tight. Elian slid into the passenger seat. The interior was dark leather and cool metal, clean but not sterile. It smelled of Kalen. Not just his personal scent, but the faint, lingering traces of his life outside the enclave, outside of being Reese's friend. The smell of rain-wet earth on his boots, of old paper from a book, of something faintly spicy, like cloves. It was a tapestry of a life lived, and it made Elian's own curated existence feel even more like a void. Kalen got in beside him, and the vehicle purred to life, its engine a low, powerful hum. He drove with focused intensity, his hands sure on the controls, navigating the garage and then ascending a ramp into the city proper. The sudden explosion of light and sound was a physical assault. Elian flinched, shielding his eyes. He hadn't been out in the city at night in years. The towering buildings were ablaze with holographic advertisements, rivers of light flowing down their sides. Flying vehicles zipped between them like metallic insects. The rain had intensified, and it streaked down the vehicle's canopy, blurring the neon chaos into a watercolor painting of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. He was outside. He was truly, irrevocably outside. The reality of it crashed down on him, and with it, a wave of such intense, disorienting heat that he gasped, pressing his forehead against the cool glass of the window. His own scent filled the enclosed space of the car, thick and sweet, a desperate biological plea. He felt Kalen's gaze on him, heavy and intense. The Alpha's knuckles were white where he gripped the steering controls. The air in the car grew thick, charged with unspoken instinct. "Just breathe, Elian," Kalen said, his voice strained. "We're almost there." Where was there? Elian didn't dare to ask. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on his breathing, but every inhale brought Kalen's scent deeper into his lungs, fanning the flames inside him. He was losing himself, the carefully constructed identity of Elian dissolving in the acid of his own biology. He was becoming a creature of instinct, of need, a being he didn't recognize. He remembered a conversation he'd overheard between Reese and Kalen years ago. They'd been in the next room, their voices low. Reese had been agitated. "You don't understand, Kale. It's not a condition, it's a curse. I saw what it did to our mother. I saw how the Alphas looked at her, like she was prey. I won't let that happen to him. I'll burn it out of him if I have to." And Kalen's quiet, chilling reply: "You can't burn out what he is, Reese. You'll only burn him." At the time, the words had been abstract, meaningless. Now, they were a prophecy unfolding in real time. The fire was consuming him, and the man who had spoken those words was sitting beside him, his scent a storm of pine and granite, driving him into an unknown future. Was he the fire? Or was he the only one who could put it out? The vehicle left the glittering spires of the city center behind, moving into the older, quieter industrial zones on the periphery. The buildings grew lower, darker, the neon giving way to the moody glow of sodium lamps. Finally, Kalen turned into a narrow, unmarked alley and pulled up to a massive, featureless metal door. With a press of a button, it rolled upwards, revealing a dark, cavernous space. He drove inside, and the door rumbled shut behind them, sealing them in darkness and silence. The world was gone. It was just the two of them, enclosed in the dark, breathing in the scent of their shared, terrifying predicament. The vehicle's engine died, plunging them into an absolute, profound silence that was the antithesis of the manufactured quiet in Elian's apartment. This was an old silence, a heavy silence, thick with the scent of dust, cold metal, and something organic and loamy, like a cellar. A moment passed, then another. Elian could hear his own ragged breathing and the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart. He could feel Kalen beside him, a solid, unmoving presence radiating a tightly controlled heat. He didn't move to get out. He just sat there in the dark, as if gathering the strength for what came next. Finally, a soft click, and the interior lights of the vehicle came on, casting them both in a pale, intimate glow. Kalen had his eyes closed, his head resting against the headrest. The iron control he had maintained was showing its first hairline fractures. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on his temples, and a muscle in his jaw jumped erratically. The air in the car was so saturated with their combined scents it was almost liquid, a dizzying cocktail of desperation and restraint. "This is it," Kalen said, his voice low and rough, not looking at Elian. He opened his eyes, which seemed darker than before, and turned his head. His gaze was heavy, intense, and stripped of all pretense. "Once we go inside, there's no turning back. Reese will escalate his search. The Bureau may get involved. You need to be sure, Elian." Sure. Elian felt anything but sure. He was a ship torn from its moorings, adrift on a stormy sea of instinct and sensation. But looking at Kalen, at the raw honesty and turmoil in his eyes, he found a strange sort of anchor. This was real. The sterile safety of his apartment was the illusion. This terrifying, uncertain moment was the truth. "I'm sure," he said, and his own voice surprised him. It was steadier than he felt, imbued with a resolve he didn't know he possessed. A flicker of something, relief, admiration, passed through Kalen's eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod and opened his door. The cool, damp air of the garage rushed in, a welcome shock to Elian's overheated skin. He fumbled with his own door, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated as another wave of heat crested within him, stronger this time, making his vision swim. He stumbled out of the vehicle, his knees threatening to buckle. Kalen was there in an instant, his arms circling Elian's waist, supporting his weight. This time, the contact was not accidental. It was necessary, and it was devastating. Elian gasped, his head falling back as Kalen's body pressed against his. He was a wall of solid warmth and muscle, and his scent, undiluted and immediate, was a direct assault on Elian's senses. The sweet, cloying smell of gardenias from his own body intensified, a frantic, answering call. He felt a low growl rumble in Kalen's chest, a primal, involuntary sound of an alpha fighting for control in the face of an overwhelming stimulus. The sound vibrated through Elian's entire body, and a deep, shuddering tremor ran through him. He was terrified. He was electrified. He felt for the first time not like a medical anomaly, but like a creature of nature, part of a violent, beautiful dance he was only just beginning to understand. "Easy," Kalen gritted out, his voice a harsh rasp. He pulled Elian along, half carrying him towards a heavy door at the far end of the garage. Just a few more steps. The space Elian now saw as his eyes adjusted was some kind of old workshop or warehouse. Massive, dormant machinery stood like sleeping metal beasts under dusty tarps. The air was thick with the ghosts of industry, oil, hot metal, and hard work. Kalen keyed in a code, and the door unlocked with a heavy thud. He guided Elian through it and into a different world. The contrast was breathtaking. They were in a living space, warm and softly lit. The air was clean, scented with old wood, books, and the faint, lingering aroma of brewed tea. It was the absolute opposite of Elian's apartment. Where his home was glass and chrome, this was wood and worn leather and dark, rich textiles. Bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with actual physical books, their spines cracked and faded. A large, comfortable-looking sofa sat before a dark fireplace, and a thick, hand-woven rug covered the polished wooden floor. It was a space that had been lived in, a space that held history and memory in its very bones. It was Kalen's sanctuary. "My studio," Kalen explained, his voice still tight as he helped Elian or to the sofa. "It's shielded. No one knows I still keep it." Elian sank into the soft cushions, the texture of the worn fabric a soothing balm against his skin. The heat was relentless now, a constant, consuming fire. His mind was fogging over, thoughts becoming slippery and hard to hold. The world was narrowing down to a collection of immediate, overwhelming sensations: the softness of the couch, the warmth of the room, the scent of Kalen. Kalen disappeared for a moment and returned with a glass of water, just as he had in the apartment. But this time, he didn't just hand it to him. He knelt in front of the sofa, holding the glass to Elian's lips. "Drink," he commanded gently. Elian obeyed, sipping the cool water. It did little to quell the internal fire, but the simple act of care, of tenderness, was a lifeline. He looked down at Kalen, who was so close now. He could see the intricate flecks of grey in his dark eyes, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the tension that held his lips in a thin, straight line. He was beautiful, in a severe, powerful way, like a storm cloud or a mountain peak. The urge to touch him, to trace the line of his jaw, was so strong it was a physical ache. As if sensing his thoughts, Kalen set the glass aside and stood up, putting distance between them again. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound stress. "The heat will get worse before it gets better," he said, his back to Elian as he stared at the cold fireplace. "It will peak. Your body will... it will demand a resolution. An alpha." He finally turned, and his face was a mask of grim resolve. "I will not touch you, Elian. I swear it. I will keep you safe. I will help you through this. But I will not be that for you." The words were a vow, a line drawn in the sand. But his body, his scent, told a different story. The air around him was thick with his own suppressed arousal, a dark, musky undertone to the clean scent of pine. He was an alpha, in denial of his own nature, fighting a war on two fronts, against Elian's biology and his own. Elian didn't know what to say. He was too lost in the tidal wave of his own body. He could only nod, a small, jerky movement. He curled in on himself on the sofa, a fresh wave of heat and cramping making him whimper. The sound was small, pathetic, but it cut through the tense air like a knife. Kalen was at his side again in an instant, his resolve visibly crumbling in the face of Elian's distress. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his hands hovering in the air, before he gently, carefully laid a hand on Elian's forehead. His palm was cool, a stark contrast to Elian's burning skin. The touch was chaste, clinical, but it was enough. Elian's entire being zeroed in on that single point of contact. A sob of pure, overwhelming relief escaped him. He leaned into the touch, a desperate, unconscious movement. Kalen didn't pull away. His fingers gently threaded into Elian's hair, his thumb stroking his temple in a slow, soothing rhythm. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice a low, hypnotic rumble. "I'm here. Just let it happen. I've got you." But Elian knew, with a terrifying, instinctual certainty, that if Kalen kept touching him, if he kept speaking to him in that low, soothing voice, if he kept surrounding him with his impossible, maddening scent, then letting it happen would lead them to a place from which neither of them could return. The line he had drawn was already starting to blur. Time lost all meaning, dissolving into a feverish cycle of sensation and instinct. Elian's world shrank to the confines of the worn leather sofa, the soft wool of a blanket Kalen had draped over him, and the overwhelming presence of the Alpha, who moved like a phantom in the periphery of his consciousness. The heat was a living entity, a predator with claws and teeth sinking itself deep into his flesh. It was pain, and a pleasure so intense it bordered on agony. It was a desperate, primal ache that radiated from the core of his being, a biological imperative screaming for a fulfillment he couldn't fully comprehend. His mind, the rational, ordered part of him that Rhys had so carefully cultivated, was gone. In its place was a raw, instinctual awareness. He was aware of the scent of his own distress, a cloyingly sweet perfume of gardenia and something metallic, like blood. He was aware of the cramping in his belly, the fire in his veins, the slickness of sweat on his skin. And above all, he was aware of Kalen. Kalen was a constant, steady presence in the storm. He kept his word. He did not touch him, not in the way Elian's body begged for. But his care was a different kind of touch, just as potent, just as intimate. He brought him water, his cool fingers brushing Elian's lips as he helped him drink. He brought cool, damp cloths to press against his forehead and the back of his neck, his movements gentle and precise. He spoke to him, his voice a low, calming murmur that cut through the fog of pain, telling him to breathe, telling him he was safe, telling him he wasn't alone. He did not eat, he did not sleep, he simply watched. He was a guardian, a sentinel, and his unwavering presence was both a comfort and a form of exquisite torture. At some point, in a moment of fleeting lucidity, Elian's eyes focused on him. Kalen was sitting in a chair across the room, shrouded in shadows, just watching him. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. The air around him was electric with the force of his control. Elian could smell the strain on him, the dark, musky scent of a contained alpha, a scent of ozone and lightning trapped in a jar. He was suffering too. This was a torment for him, a test of will so profound it was physically changing the atmosphere of the room. A wave of guilt, sharp and piercing, cut through Elian's haze. He was doing this to him. His body, his nature, was the source of this agony. "Go," Elian rasped, his throat raw. "You should. Leave me." Kalen's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Elian's in the dim light. "No," he said, the word absolute, unyielding. He rose and came to kneel by the sofa again, his movements stiff. He was closer now than he had been in hours. The proximity was dizzying. "I'm not leaving you, Elian." "You're in pain," Elian whispered, tears welling in his eyes, born of fever and a strange, protective empathy for his tormentor and savior. "This is hurting you." Kalen's expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing into something akin to sorrow. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently brushed a damp strand of hair from Elian's face. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shockwave through Elian's system. "It doesn't matter," Kalen said, his voice rough. "Seeing you like this, knowing what Rhys and the Bureau would do to you, that's worse." A memory surfaced in Elian's fevered mind, a fragment from a long time ago. He was a boy, maybe 10, visiting Kalen's family home with Rhys. Kalen had a younger sister, an Omega named Lyra. She was vibrant and full of laughter, with a scent like wildflowers and sunshine. Elian remembered watching her, fascinated. Later, he'd heard whispers, an accident, a heat that had come too early, too strong, an alpha who hadn't been able to control himself. Lyra was sent away to a special facility in the Northern Territories. He never saw her again. Kalen, who had adored her, became quiet, withdrawn, his youthful energy hardening into the controlled stillness Elian knew today. The memory clicked into place with a horrifying, clarifying snap. This wasn't just about him. This was a ghost. He was a ghost. Kalen was saving the boy he couldn't save his sister from becoming. Lyra, Elian breathed the name, not even realizing he was speaking it aloud. Kalen flinched as if struck. All the air seemed to leave his body, and the control he had so fiercely maintained shattered. A look of such profound, naked grief passed over his face that it stole Elian's breath. He pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The truth of it hung between them, raw and bleeding. "She trusted them," Kalen said, his voice a choked whisper. "The doctors, the system, they promised they could manage it. They promised she could have a normal life. They filled her with suppressants until she didn't know who she was. And when they failed, they blamed her. They called her biology a defect. They locked her away, Elian, not to protect her, to hide their failure." He looked at Elian, his eyes burning with a decade of repressed fury and sorrow. "That is what Reese is doing to you. He's following their playbook. He's so terrified of losing you that he's willing to let you be erased. I will not let that happen." The confession, the raw emotion, changed everything. This was not just an act of friendship to Reese or pity for Woolian. It was an atonement, a rebellion, a desperate attempt to rewrite the past. And in that moment, Elian's own feelings, so long buried under a blanket of chemicals and fear, began to crystallize. This ache in his chest wasn't just instinct. It wasn't just the heat. It was a deep, resonant connection to the man kneeling before him, a man who saw past the Omega condition and saw him. Just Elian. The peak of the heat came upon him then, a tsunami of sensation that obliterated thought. A raw cry was torn from his throat as his whole body arched on the sofa. The pain was blinding, the need of physical entity clawing its way out of him. His scent exploded into the room, a desperate, final plea. It was the scent of surrender. Through a haze of tears and agony, he saw Kalen rise, his body trembling, his eyes dilated, the last vestiges of his control burned away by Elian's cry. The alpha in him was finally, irrevocably, unleashed. He moved to the sofa, not with violence, but with a kind of grim, magnetic inevitability. He lay down behind Elian, pulling him back against his chest, wrapping his strong arms around him. Elian stiffened for a second, then melted into the embrace, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief racking his body. Kalen's body was a furnace, his heat a grounding force against Elian's chaotic fire. He buried his face in Elian's neck, his breath hot against his skin. He didn't bite. He didn't claim. He just held him. He began to release his own scent, not the aggressive, challenging scent of an aroused alpha, but something else entirely. It was a scent of comfort, of protection. The sharp edges of pine and stone softened, mingling with a warmer, richer note of amber and sandalwood. A nesting scent, a calming scent. He was using his own biology, the very thing he had been fighting, to soothe Elian, to guide him through the storm. "Breathe with me, Elian," he murmured into his ear, his voice a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through Elian's skull. "In and out. I'm here. You're safe. I've got you." Elian obeyed, his ragged breaths slowly starting to match the steady, powerful rhythm of Kalen's. The alpha's scent filled his senses, a calming balm on his raw nerves. It was an anchor. It was a shield. The pain didn't vanish, but it receded, the sharp edges blurring. The frantic, desperate need eased, replaced by a profound, bone-deep sense of safety. He was being held. He was being protected. He was not alone in the fire. He was being seen. He drifted in that space between agony and peace, held securely in the arms of his brother's best friend, the Alpha who was rewriting his own tragedy by saving Elian from his. And as consciousness finally began to fray at the edges, pulling him down into a deep, exhausted sleep, his last coherent thought was not one of fear, but of a strange, terrifying, and beautiful certainty. He was home. The descent from the peak was slow, like waking from a long and turbulent dream. Elian drifted in a quiet, liminal space, his body heavy and boneless, his mind a placid lake after a storm. The fire in his veins had subsided to a warm, pleasant hum. The frantic edge of need was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant calm. He was aware, before he even opened his eyes, of two things: the scent of Kaelin, which was now inextricably woven with his own, a harmonious blend of forest and rain-soaked gardenias, and the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart against his ear. He was still pressed against Kaelin's chest, their limbs entangled on the sofa, the wool blanket cocooning them both. Kaelin's arms were still wrapped around him, his hold secure even in sleep. The intimacy of the position should have felt scandalous, terrifying. Instead, it felt right, inescapable, as natural as breathing. Elian lay perfectly still, not wanting to break the spell. He listened to the sound of Kaelin's breathing, felt the slow rise and fall of his chest. This was a peace he had never known, a sense of belonging that his sterile, curated life had never offered. For 10 years, he had been a ghost in his own life, a biological secret wrapped in layers of denial. In the last 24 hours, he had been torn apart and remade, and in the arms of this quiet, tormented Alpha, he felt, for the first time, whole. He must have stirred, because Kaelin's breathing hitched, then deepened. The arms around him tightened for a moment before loosening. He was awake. A tense silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken reality of what had passed. Elian felt a flush of shame, of vulnerability. He had been so exposed, so raw, a creature of pure instinct. Kaelin had seen the most primal, uncurated version of him. Elian, Kaelin's voice was a low rumble, thick with sleep.